Films about real people are tricky. There are so many different ways to approach them and so many ways to get them wrong. Many times they're simply based on a true story. Other times they're about an event or group of people, and other times you get the dreaded cradle-to-casket biopics. Think Ray, among others, which isn't a bad movie. There are others that are much worse, but it definitely falls into many of those cliches. A while back I made a video about this exact thing when talking about At Eternity's Gate, the Vincent van Gogh film, and how it subverts so many of those biopic tropes to create a vivid and brilliant portrait of the late artist. I do think there is very much a distinction between a biopic and a character study about a real person or real event, and I find the latter to be much more interesting. That is when I believe you really get to something authentic and compelling about your subject. And in the last 25 years, there's been one director who's tackled movies about real people with grace and nuance, that being Bennett Miller. Miller is a guy who's always kind of fascinated me because he's only ever made 3 narrative feature films. They're all about real people, 2 are about the world of sports, and they all got tons of awards attention. He's been nominated for 2 Oscars for directing, 2 of his films have been nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, and all 3 leads of his films have been nominated too. He's also won the award for Best Directing at the Cannes Film Festival, and I don't want to make it seem like awards or Oscars are the only barometer for success, but he has an impressive resume. He just seems like a guy that would maybe make more movies, or at least be attached to more projects, but no. For now we only have these 3 films. So today I want to take a closer look at them and see what makes his work so unique, why his biopics, for lack of a better word, work, and what connective tissue is between these films. Also, I will be going into spoilers for these movies, so you've been warned. Bennett Miller was born in New York City and grew up in Westchester County. His mother was a painter and his father was an engineer. He met friend Dan Futterman when he was around 12 years old, where the two would go to Mamaroneck High School together. When the two were around 16, they attended a theater program in upstate New York where they would meet this random guy you might have heard of, Philip Seymour Hoffman. They would meet again later as classmates at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, but Miller would drop out before graduating. While there, Miller was a founding member of the short-lived Bolstoy Ensemble Theater Company, along with Hoffman and fellow actor Stephen Shub. While there, the 3 men made a pact that if any of them ever won an Academy Award, their entire acceptance speech would consist of nothing but barking. Miller's film career started with the 1998 documentary The Cruise, a film about Timothy Speed Levitch, a tour guide for Manhattan's Grey Line double-decker bus, and the tough life NYC tour guides have. The film was made using handheld digital cameras. Miller had a hard time getting it into festivals. It was turned down by every single one until it got to screen at a small independent film festival in LA, thanks to a friend to whom the owner owed a favor. After that, it started garnering critical acclaim, and he was able to submit it to a bunch of other film festivals, including Berlin and Toronto, among others. After that, Miller was shooting commercials, reading scripts, and figuring out what would be his first narrative film, when he got a call from old friend Dan Futterman, who told him he was working on a film about Truman Capote during his time writing the novel In Cold Blood. He was initially surprised since Futterman was an actor and told him best of luck, but soon the first draft of the script had come together, and as Futterman and Miller kept talking about it, Miller eventually decided to direct the film. Futterman said that while reading In Cold Blood, he felt that the most interesting character was Capote himself and wanted to investigate that idea further. The first thing they decided they needed to do was attach a credible actor to the film, and their first choice was old friend Philip Seymour Hoffman. Phil was really their only choice, and had he not agreed, the film most likely would have been scrapped. Phil was initially very unsure if he could do Truman Capote justice, since he was such a specific and unique figure. He talked and moved in such an unusual way, plus Phil was much bigger in stature, and he had this deep, commanding voice. But he eventually agreed. The physical aspect took a little to work around. Capote was 5'2", and Phil around 5'10", and weighed around 240 pounds around the time of filming. Miller worked with his costume designer to create suits with tight shoulders so that Hoffman's head would appear bigger in proportion to his body, thus giving off the illusion that his frame was smaller. The director also cast taller actors and others on apple boxes when they appeared opposite Hoffman so that the character would be the right size. While it took work to turn Hoffman into a physical Capote, Miller said the actor nailed the emotional stuff right from the beginning. Phil developed all the internal stuff for Capote alone by studying tapes of him and reading his work and biographies for about 6 months. Miller gives so much credit to Phil and how he captured something about Capote that he couldn't have gotten without him. Phil and Capote had a lot of similarities that Miller said he realized only later into filming, and surmises that might be why Phil was so tapped into the character. Filming mostly took place in Winnipeg, Canada, due to the shocking similarities it shares with Kansas, where a majority of the film takes place. They made sure to film in the ugly season, right before the snow falls. Apparently, it began snowing minutes before they shot the final exterior scene. It was a miracle. They found the house from the opening scene abandoned and used a good chunk of the budget to rebuild it for the film. Of course, the first thing you notice when watching is the music and opening credits of the film. They are designed to slow you down and ready you for the pace of the film. This will become a reoccurring theme for Miller, but he likes a very minimal score and a very muted looking color palette to his films. A lot of the lovely exterior shots were filmed alone by DP Adam Kimmel. He actually just went out one day on his own and shot some of them as test footage, and they ended up in the film. Some of the other exterior shots, like the train moving through the plain, took hours to plan and get, but Miller would make sure he was there for all of them. He wanted to make sure his crew knew how committed he was to the film. The transition from New York to Kansas is great, and Miller effectively uses handheld cinematography here, something he does rather sparingly. Phil actually improvises a lot of dialogue here, using anecdotes from his life and from other people he's heard before. He does this for almost every party shot in the film. Miller also moves through exposition scenes rather quickly, only giving viewers the necessary things they need to know, something I appreciate about his work. He talks in the commentary track about how he trusts his audience to make those leaps. We don't need a scene explaining why Capote wants to write about this case. We can just accept it grabbed his attention. What I think makes the film work, and going forward all of Miller's films work to varying degrees, is his approach is always to focus on a very specific point in time for these characters. We don't need 20 minutes on his childhood. We learn about his past and who he is by spending time with him and seeing the character exist before our eyes. I think Miller has a real knack for this type of storytelling. I think if Capote featured scenes from before or after this part of his life, it would lose a lot of its power. I really love how well-rounded and complicated Phil's take on Capote is. He's arrogant, vain, pretentious. I love lines like,
Bergdorf's.
Sorry?
The scarf.
Oh, nice.
Thank you.
Did Laura say shattered?
Pretty shattered. Nothing terrible ever happened to him before. Yeah, I have 94% recall of all conversations.
94%.
I've tested myself. Bon voyage, gals.
I can't believe you got that whole page. I only read it once.
I've tested
Testing
myself.
myself.
I have 94%
That
recall. Cut that out. Cut that. Cut that out.
but he's also deeply reflective and intelligent and cares a lot about his work and making it as great as possible. We'll get into it later, but easily the most complicated relationship in the film is him with Perry Smith, where I believe the emotional core of the film lies. Also, we can't forget about Catherine Keener, who is absolutely lovely as Harper Lee Miller. I didn't even know until I saw the movie the first time that they were childhood friends, and that she was incredibly involved in the writing of this novel. I think the scenes of both of them together really help to highlight the different side of Capote. Miller calls Nell a grounded spirit. Chris Cooper is also great in a very restrained performance. The film really begins to open up when we're introduced to the killers of the film, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. Perry is a central figure in the film and such a rich and tragic character. Clifton Collins Jr. is fantastic in this role. The crew constantly talks about how much pathos Collins brought to the role. He's scared and afraid and seems to show genuine remorse for his actions. This is really where we see the gears turn for Capote. He sees this broken and troubled man as a well of information for the book. The relationship the two build is genuine but deeply complicated. I love how Miller makes us sit in that gray area and show us a really murky side of Capote and the lengths he went to for this novel at the sake of his own morality. Capote genuinely relates to Perry and cares for him, but at the same time thinks he should die for his crimes. And while Perry is aware of the novel, he doesn't know the way that Truman is framing him in the book. We see how cold and calculating Capote can be for the sake of his work, but also over time how that eats away and crushes him. This is really where the film shines. In terms of plot, it's fairly light. The rest of the movie is really about his relationship with Perry, where we see Capote visit Perry and then go back to writing his book, and we watch how that process plays out and how the closer Capote gets to Perry, the harder it becomes to write. I think a scene that really highlights this is when Capote has to share an excerpt from his book in front of a live audience, and once he begins to read, or right before he begins to read, we can see how complicated his relationship with this material becomes, even though he knows it's great and wants to share it with the world. And then a couple scenes later, we see Perry confront him about this and the name In Cold Blood, and how Capote has to lie about it for the sake of his novel. Eventually, there is a date for Perry's execution. The scene of their final goodbye, followed by the hanging, is brutal and cold. Miller really grounds it in reality. Even the sounds of the rope were exact. In the scene where Capote says goodbye, Phil initially didn't want to cry, finding it a little too much, but Miller insisted he try one with it, and though Phil resisted, once he got into that headspace, he said the tears just started flowing and it felt like a much more honest moment. The film ends on a quote from Capote's unfinished work after In Cold Blood came out. More tears are shed over answered prayers than unanswered ones. We see in those final moments how hard this had been for Capote. What that quote seems to mean is that the book can't come out unless they die, and that paradox eats away at Truman. This is something the real-life Truman Capote really struggled with, and it's believed it's the reason he never finished a book again. He fractured a lot of relationships and really changed as a person as a result of the book, and I think that internal conflict is what makes this character so compelling, especially because the book was so widely successful. Visually, there's nothing flashy about the filmmaking, but Miller is a very smart and purposeful director. When talking about his own style, Miller says his style is sedate, it's controlled and sensitizing, and he thinks it enlivens and puts you on your toes and heightens your awareness. The choice to shoot it on Super 35 was a gut reaction from the DP, mostly so scenes like in the jail would actually feel smaller and more claustrophobic by showing the whole cell. For the most part, Miller's style stays the same throughout his filmography, but he does make distinct choices when needed. When talking about why the film has muted colors, he says that he prefers to use muted colors but creates a very textured film in its place, and I think you can feel that here. All the sets feel very alive, and he works very closely with his production designer, Jess Gonchor, who he's worked with on all 3 of his feature films. Miller is also a bit of a tinkerer, specifically when it comes to dialogue scenes. He says he tends to work on them for a lot longer, constantly retooling and reshaping them. In terms of a debut feature film, this is an incredibly strong showing. Miller shows a real command for the medium and uses a lot of restraint. It also helps that Hoffman delivers a towering performance, literally transforming himself. While not the easiest watch, it is a quiet and heavy character study. I think it's a pretty great example of why character studies prove to be much richer films than standard biopics.
Because since I was a child, folks have thought they had me pegged because of the way I am. You know, the way I talk, and they're always wrong. You know what I mean?
Capote was a critical hit and would go on to be nominated for 5 Oscars, including Best Director, Best Lead Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Picture, with 1 win for Best Actor. And even though Phil had made a promise to bark years earlier, he gave a very normal speech when accepting. After the success of Capote, Miller actually wanted to get Foxcatcher made, but couldn't get the financing. According to an article from Vulture documenting the making of the film, he worked on an early draft with novelist David Eggers and screenwriter Max E. Fry, who's known for Something Wild. He also began looking for actors to fill the roles of John DuPont and Mark Schultz. Ryan Gosling and Bill Nighy were considered, as was Heath Ledger. But surprisingly enough, Miller saw an actor way back in 2006 in a film called A Guide to Recognize Your Saints that he thought was perfect for the role. This guy was named, let me check my notes. Okay, yeah, Channing Tatum. That's not going to become important in the future, surely. Eventually, the writer's strike was looming, and by the time it came and went, Fry had moved on to other projects. So who steps in? Our old friend Futterman from Capote, who would work on the story with Miller on and off again for the next 4 years. Spike Jonze, who was in Los Angeles editing Where the Wild Things Are, lent them an office, and as Miller quoted saying, "It was just wall-to-wall push-pin boards, which is basically my dream come true." Eventually, Miller felt the script was ready to bring to producers, but there was a lot of tension over multiple things, including the cast, which at the time had no real stars, and Miller began to realize the film might not happen. Years later, he said, "I realized I can do anything, as long as it's something someone else wants to do." Miller did seem to enjoy his breaks between films and describes himself as an introvert. In an interview, he says, "Some people are really energized by making a film. Some are exhausted." He said, "I'm exhausted. I think, oh God, I'm never going to do that again." To make a film, the amount of control you have to conjure to do it it's a slightly different person. Sometimes in the edit, I'll hear my voice off camera and I'll cringe. I'll think, who is that person torturing those actors? In 2006, he directed the Bob Dylan music video for When the Deal Goes Down, featuring Scarlett Johansson, and then in 2008, directed the music video for Scarlett Johansson's cover of the Tom Waits song, Falling Down. Then, in 2009, Miller was hired by Columbia Pictures to direct Moneyball after previous director Steven Soderbergh dropped out due to creative differences. The original script was written by screenwriting journeyman Steven Zalian. Soderbergh's version of the film would have been very different. Dimitri Martin was tapped to play the role that would eventually go to Jonah Hill. It would have also featured some of the actual baseball players, including Scott Hatterberg and David Justice. It began to fall apart when Soderbergh turned in a new script days before filming that was filled with what they deemed too many baseball details that would alienate the audience, especially with its $58 million budget. Soderbergh decided to leave and the project was reworked. Aaron Sorkin was brought in for a rewrite and Miller was brought in to direct. Sorkin agreed on the condition Zalian give his blessing, which he eventually got. Miller was hesitant to accept the job and stated he wasn't interested in a traditional sports film and wanted to make something that would subvert the genre. Eventually, after 3 weeks, he agreed.
Everybody, listen up. You may not look like a winning team, but you are one. So, play like one tonight.
For the uninitiated, Moneyball is the story of Billy Beane, who was the general manager of the Oakland A's, one of the poorest teams in baseball, and helped pioneer a different type of method for building a team in baseball that relied on computers and analytics instead of traditional scouting and talent. To this day, it proves to be incredibly controversial, but it undoubtedly changed baseball, especially because it was shockingly successful, especially in the year the film takes place. Once production was up and running, things were relatively smooth according to people who worked on the film. Since the stadium essentially functions as a character, there was a lot of work to make sure it was accurately depicted. They were able to use multiple stadiums for the film, including the A's Coliseum, Dodger Stadium, and Blair Field. For scenes of actual games, where they would need big crowds, they would shoot it with just a small amount of people in the stands and fill the rest in during post. When it came to uniforms, they were actually able to get the MLB to dress the players and coaches with actual vintage uniforms. The dugout set took about 3 months to build and were made to be very accurate, including the fluorescent lights inside. Initially, Adam Kimmel was set to return as Miller's DP, but was fired due to sexual assault allegations. Turns out he's a really bad guy, and if you care, you can read more about it online. He was replaced with DP Wally Pfister, who's best known for Inception. Instead of using even light, Pfister used mood lighting to enhance the drama of the nighttime baseball scenes. Predictably, there was very strict control of the color palette because of the A's, lots of greens, yellows, and whites. The colors are muted again, but very deep, especially the greens. For the flashback scenes, they decided not to treat the film too drastically. It was a big deal to make sure the team on the field looked correct and knew how to play. They started with archival footage and used that as a stepping stone. The MLB provided them with tons of material, so they were able to choreograph with the actual baseball games. Speaking of archive footage, I absolutely love the opening of this film. The title card of that Mickey Mantle quote, the subtle score, the archive footage of the A's vs Yankees game really sets the tone going forward. It's captivating, it's real, and it draws you into the reality of the film. Then, cut to Billy at that empty, quiet, haunting Coliseum. Evokes so much. How lonely and devastating sports can be when you're on the wrong side of them. You immediately feel that stillness and composure that seems to define Bennett's work. Again, this film cuts out a lot of fat. Exposition never feels drawn out or dull. And then we're introduced to Brad Pitt as Billy Bean, who is unbelievable in what I think is one of his best performances. At this point in his career, Pitt is able to weaponize his charm and good looks to be much more thoughtful and introspective in his work, and I think Billy is the perfect character for that. Pitt is also one of cinema's best eaters. I want to know how many takes he did of eating that whole Twinkie. Now, this is easily Miller's lightest and funniest movie, and I think a lot of that can be attributed to Sorkin and Zalian's script. It's informative but punchy, funny but heartfelt, and I think Miller's very controlled visual style meshes very well with Sorkin's fast and snappy dialogue. And I'm a big baseball fan, so I enjoy a lot of the technical terms in the film, but I think they do an excellent job of getting all that information across in a very entertaining and digestible way that would appeal to a wider audience. Scenes like the team meeting really highlight this. They're popping with great lines, but really effective at getting to the point of what this film is trying to accomplish and never overstays their welcome.
Is there another first baseman like Giambi?
No, not really.
No.
And if there was, could we afford him?
Nope.
Then what the fuck are you talking about, man? If we try to play like the Yankees in here, we will lose to the Yankees out there.
Let's not forget about the supporting cast of the film. I definitely think one of Miller's strong suits is directing actors. He always gets great performances out of his cast. Jonah Hill, of course, plays Billy's right-hand man, Peter Brand, who's based on Paul Di Podesta. The real Di Podesta had asked if his name could be removed from the film, since he felt the character no longer reflected him accurately. I love Hill's performance here. It's a quiet performance, but very funny and sincere. I think making Hill an introvert in this film plays really well off of Pitt, and the two really bounce off of each other. The other supporting characters are great. Philip Seymour Hoffman is back with Miller as the manager of the A's, Art Howe. Phil is always fantastic and really gets the most out of every scene he's in. Though I do think it's worth noting that the real Art Howe and people who were with him in Oakland have said his portrayal in the film wasn't very accurate, especially in his treatment of Scott Hatteberg. Speaking of Scott Hatteberg, Chris Pratt is surprisingly great here too, and I think gives a very genuine and heartfelt performance. Pratt said he was initially told he was too fat for the role, so he worked for 3 months to shed 30 pounds, which eventually won it for him. We also have Robin Wright as Billy's ex-wife and Spike Jonze in a very small but funny role as Wright's new husband. I always love it when directors have supporting roles in films. Catherine Morris was cast as Bean's current wife, but she was cut entirely from the film. There's some deleted scenes with her on the Blu-ray, which after watching, I think it was a good choice to remove her entirely. It's not that she's bad, it's just that the relationship doesn't make sense for this film, and I think it functions a lot better to see Pitt lonely. Karis Dorsey plays Bean's daughter Casey, who is very sweet, and while her role is pretty small, I'd say she plays a big part in helping us understand who Billy is as a person, and how being a dad affects his decision making, especially when it comes to other players. Stephen Bishop, who plays veteran David Justice in the film, actually grew up idolizing Justice, and even played professional baseball for the Advanced A affiliate team of the Braves, where Justice was on their roster. The real fun of this film starts once Bean hires Peter Brand as his assistant GM, and the two start figuring out ways to stretch the small amount of money they have into a winning roster using the Moneyball tactic. We also learn through flashbacks about Bean's past as a professional player, which is somewhat rare for a GM. Bean himself was a high prospect for the Mets, but he didn't pan out, and I think the script effectively uses that to inform the way that Billy builds the team now. The flashbacks, thankfully, are very simple and to the point. They don't linger for too long, and I think a lot of the beauty of this film is watching the team grow and get better. Sorkin loves characters who are clearly good at their job but are seen as underdogs, and you can tell he relishes in writing a guy like Billy Bean. And the movie itself allows itself to be fun. We see the players getting better, and Billy's confidence in his new system grow, even while fighting with his staff. And there are harder moments spread out, like when Peter Brand has to let a player know he's been traded, or when Billy lets a player know he's going to the minors. Baseball movies have been around for decades and decades, but what I love about this film is that it still shares the romanticism for baseball, but just like Billy bringing baseball into the 21st century, the look and feel of this film is also modern. Miller wanted to make a baseball movie that felt subversive, and he does just that. He grounds it in a really important reality. There are jobs on the line, people supporting their family. I think this movie does a great job at not only depicting the beauty of the sport, but the inherent tragedy of the business side of the sport. We can talk about these players like they're just numbers and stats on a screen, but there's a person behind those numbers, and the film doesn't shy away from that. One thing I haven't brought up yet that I really locked into when watching again was the editing and sound design, which I actually think is the secret ingredient as to why this film is so successful. The way sounds layer over each other using that archive footage, recreations on the field, voiceover from flashbacks, and so on, really add to the atmosphere of the film and the emotional weight that Billy is feeling at any given time. Without a lot of that archive footage or overlaying, I think this film loses a lot of its punch.
Billy,
I think it's time that we start thinking about getting a new GM here, making some changes.
goes to the games.
This
He
is
needs
very
to turn around.
predictable,
He
and
needs
we're
to
seeing
look
it
at
right
what's
now.
going on here. The man needs to get baseball. He's trying to
I want Billy Bean gone.
Calling for Billy Bean's head. What are your thoughts?
Past 18 games, they've been shut out or scored 1 run 4 times. They're just not scoring enough.
I've been a baseball fan and a Mets fan my entire life, and I played baseball for most of my childhood. Maybe I was predisposed to enjoying this film, but what I think it nails so hard is the feeling that baseball gives you both as a player and a fan. It's hard to be a fan of a bad team, and it's hard to play for a bad team. Baseball is a long sport, and it leaves a lot of room for reflection. But when it works, when it finally starts getting good, there is nothing more magical than watching your favorite team play well. And you can feel it. As the A's team gets better and better, it's so fun to watch. And seeing them climb closer and closer to that record for most consecutive wins still gives me butterflies. And seeing Hatterberg hit that home run to give the A's the longest win streak in baseball history with this raggy tag group of guys is so special. But then it stings just as hard watching them lose in the playoffs and see all that hard work come to an end. This movie also nails the superstitions in baseball, how Billy won't watch the games or guys having pre-game rituals. Baseball is a very streaky sport, and those rituals become very important to players. I love how they still stick with Billy. In my opinion, this is Miller's best film where it just feels like all the stars aligned. It's a sweet and funny movie with a strong emotional core and some great performances. Miller's sedate filmmaking with Sorkin and Zalian's brilliant screenplay feels like a match made in heaven, and I'm also just a sucker for a great baseball film.
How can you not be romantic about baseball?
Moneyball was a critical and commercial hit, grossing $75.6 million in North America and $34.6 million overseas, making $110.2 million on a budget of $50 million. Not bad. The film was widely loved by critics on a number of Best of the Year lists and was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor, but failed to win any. After directing 2 Best Picture nominated films as his first 2 films, Miller finally had enough cachet to begin work on Foxcatcher.
Mr. Pond, I need you to know that I'm so grateful for what you've done for me.
Well, first of all, I don't want you to call me Mr. DuPont or Sir anymore. I consider us friends, and most of my friends will call me Eagle or Golden Eagle. So either of those.
Foxcatcher is the true story of brothers and Olympic wrestlers Dave and Mark Schultz, who start training with Team Foxcatcher for the 1988 Seoul Olympics, led by multimillionaire John DuPont, which led to a bizarre and eventually fatal conclusion. According to the Vulture article detailing the making of Foxcatcher, while in post on Moneyball, Miller ran into old friend and now famous movie star Channing Tatum at the Sony lot and asked if he'd be interested in Foxcatcher again. Tatum, who was older and more mature, finally felt he can properly commit to this character. He also got help from notorious overspender and director-friendly Megan Ellison, head of Annapurna Pictures. I can't speak on the current ongoings of Annapurna, but what made them so special in the early years is that they would seemingly just throw money at art house directors for mid-budget passion projects that were often great, but would typically fail to make their money back. They still produce movies, but over the last few years seem to have shifted their focus to video games and TV, presumably because they kept losing money. But back in 2011, Ellison agreed to finance the film without even reading the script. Those were the days. Not too long after, Steve Carell came aboard to play John DuPont. He wasn't the first choice for the role, apparently that was Gary Oldman, but his commitment to Dawn of the Planet of the Apes made Miller pivot. Miller, however, liked the idea of Carell, who at the time was only really known for his comedic work. As Steve put it to me, he usually plays characters with a mushy center. DuPont really doesn't have that, and neither does Steve. He's a comic, which to me always means that there's a dark side. After that meeting, I felt he would be the greatest risk, but also the best choice. Ruffalo also signed on to play Schultz's older brother Dave, who, funny enough, was offered the role of Perry Smith in Capote all those years ago. Ruffalo had lost a brother a few years earlier, so the subject matter hit very close for him. He was actually a high school wrestler that considered playing in college, and felt he understood the mentality of wrestlers, the discipline and loneliness. While he came in with that background, Ruffalo said he had to unlearn everything for the film. For one, Schultz was a lefty and Ruffalo a righty, but on top of that, Ruffalo was 47 at the time, playing a 33-year-old in his athletic prime, and as he says, the training was just shattering to me physically. Production for Foxcatcher would start outside of Pittsburgh in 2012. The crew couldn't use DuPont's actual mansion since it was demolished soon after filming started, so in its place they used the estate Morven Park in Virginia and mansion Wypen Hall in Pittsburgh. Interestingly enough, Miller brought on another writer, Kristen Gore, to help on set. Though Miller has a very deliberate and controlled visual style, he actually enjoys the ability to adapt and change scenes on the fly. The spontaneity, he says, is when scenes and moments truly reveal themselves. Foxcatcher also opens on archive footage. We also have Miller's trademark minimal score and muted color palette. Here, I actually think it's very effective in conveying the cold and distant feeling of the wrestling world. The opening scene between Mark and Dave is very haunting, especially with no music to it. They move like a dance, but the underlying tension is very unnerving. They feel like animals. They become seemingly primal. One of the film's most underrated qualities is the sound editing. There's a very tactile texture to the movie that's emphasized by the sound design. It gives much more weight to the brutal physicality of wrestling. Miller actually had Channing and Ruffalo train with some wrestlers that the real Dave Schultz knew. Tatum and Ruffalo would often follow 12-hour shooting days with 2 hours of weight training and wrestling practice. Freestyle wrestling is so claustrophobic, a grind of pain and exhaustion due to a degree that I can't even describe, says Tatum. Mark Ruffalo and I held each other and wept like children after the last wrestling scene was over. That's how ready I was to be done with it. I think this is as good a time as any to praise Channing Tatum because he is phenomenal here. I think the best performance in the film, and maybe the best performance I've ever seen from him. He's a very troubled and internal character that has to be so physically commanding, and Tatum is up for the task. While it's not explicitly talked about in the film, I think a big part of Foxcatcher is about the mental health of athletes and how so often they are told to suck it up or be a man, and those feelings compound over time. Wrestling is a sport that is all about masculinity and physicality, but there's a real emotional and psychological element as well that isn't talked about as much. And we see in sports how talking about your feelings or dealing with mental health is something that many athletes struggle with. And without explicitly saying it, I think Tatum's performance is showing us someone going through this exact thing. There are so many moments where we see on Tatum's face that he is struggling, but doesn't understand how to process and articulate his feelings, and how that boils over into physical rage. Tatum shows a clear frustration to his performance. Not an easy thing to pull off. And Ruffalo is also fantastic and becomes the emotional heart of the film. He gives a really sensitive performance that makes the final act all the more tragic. Now, I guess we should talk about probably the most discussed part of the film, that being Steve Carell. Now, I don't think it's a bad performance, but I honestly find all the makeup a bit distracting. Don't get me wrong, he does feel otherworldly, and Miller even says he wanted Carell to be unrecognizable, but I think they might have gone a bit overboard. When talking about the makeup, Carell says he felt the cast and crew became more distant, and he hadn't anticipated how it would draw everyone away emotionally and physically. Miller also made sure Tatum and Carell didn't talk to each other on set when they were filming. He wanted there to be a coldness between them. Tatum said in an interview how he felt that he didn't actually meet Carell until the premiere of the film in Cannes. Miller seems to have pushed his actors a lot harder in this film than in other films, and I don't say that in a derogatory way. It seems that everyone involved really appreciated the work they were doing, but that Miller really knew the story he wanted to tell, and that it took an emotional and physical toll on everyone, especially the actors. Miller, who talks a lot about how he's an introvert, says he made a very conscious effort to be uncomfortable and challenged his actors to do the same. They were always trying new things, pushing themselves, anything was fair game. One anecdote I love from that Vulture article is where Carell says, Miller told him, write the worst thing about yourself, the thing you wouldn't tell anyone, not even your wife. on a piece of paper, put it in your pocket of your sweatpants. Just have it right there and know that it's in a place where if I was a dick, I could just grab it. The scene that resulted, says Miller, might be my favorite thing I've ever put on film. Knowing the subject matter, Miller didn't want this to be easy for anyone. Ruffalo says that Miller could tell when people would get in their comfort zone and would constantly force them out of it. Again, why I think Miller is so good at these character studies is that he understands these stories are far more interesting when we just stick to a certain point in time. Just like Capote and Moneyball, the fact that we only focus on this part of the Schultz lives only adds to the emotional depth of the characters and the story being told. Miller thankfully moves very quickly through the exposition of the film and lays the framework for the rest of the film early on. We know that Mark Schultz idolizes but envies his older brother Dave, that John DuPont becomes a father-like figure, but slowly we see how complicated and toxic that relationship becomes, especially when Dave becomes more present again. Now, I want to say this before we dive deeper, but after rewatching this film for the first time since it was in theaters, I do think it's Miller's weakest film. It's not bad, but I think it's flawed, heavy, and incredibly bleak. Now, as I've gone over already, Miller's films have always been rather still and controlled, but with his previous two films, there's a levity that cuts through the sadness, especially in Moneyball, which is practically a comedy. Even in Capote, which is about a very sensitive subject matter, Capote himself is a very layered and funny character that allows himself moments of joy. But with Foxcatcher, Miller cuts out all of that, and I understand why he does. I can see his thought process, but that combined with a very bizarre Carell performance makes for a very bleak and difficult watch that I think keeps viewers at arm's length a bit too much. Also, Sienna Miller playing Dave's wife is essentially wasted here. She's given about next to nothing to do. That being said, I still want to talk about what I think the film succeeds in and what I think Miller accomplishes here. In terms of plot, for the remainder of the film, it's pretty light. Most of what we watch unfold is how the relationship between Mark and John evolves and eventually implodes. I do think that relationship is really interesting, not just from a parental perspective, but from a class perspective. I think one of the film's central themes is that of American ambition and how it's begun to rot. The idea of what patriotism is, what it's become, and how people push themselves to dangerous places for the sake of their country. Wrestling is a very primal sport, and the world John comes from is high class. So there's the tension between John and his mother, who sees wrestling as beneath him, and then the tension between John and the wrestlers. And it becomes very clear that John doesn't want to just help Mark, he wants to be Mark, this physical specimen. John even tries to wrestle later in the film. He wants to be their coach, but he knows nothing. All he can offer is money, and he wants to be like them, but also hold power over them. So the line between them continues to blur as the film goes on, and that conflict is incredibly fascinating. Miller is clearly interrogating America's history and how the idea of high society is fading, and these people, the DuPonts, are trying to hold on to it. They still engage in these archaic traditions. And I mean, just look at the estate in the film. Inside and out, it's from a bygone era, filled with medals, flags, antiques, so desperately trying to hold on to that old America. And especially in the context of today's political climate, it feels very terrifying. Foxcatcher Estate is like a labyrinth. DuPont's mother, played by Vanessa Redgrave, is a very unique character in the film. She's like an apparition haunting the grounds, tormenting John for not living up to his standards. I think her presence adds a lot of depth to John, because while the whole mommy angle isn't original per se, I think here you can see that although John is a deeply weird and troubled man, he also has never truly had the emotional support he needed, and by throwing money at him, it has only created a monster. Another thing I wanted to quickly highlight was the use of music in the film. From what I remember, this is the first time Miller uses an actual song in any of his films, which I found interesting. I love the way that Tatum and eventually Ruffalo grows more hostile as the film goes on, and the relationship begins to fracture the more DuPont tries to become involved. Each scene becomes increasingly more uncomfortable. There's a number of great scenes depicting that tension. The one of Dave being forced to compliment DuPont in a video, the scene of John trying to coach when his mother comes to the gym, and especially the scene of DuPont slapping Mark, which seems to be the final straw, and Tatum with just a single expression conveys so much. And there's a decent amount of film left after, but we really don't see John and Mark together after that, and that tension lingers for the remainder of the runtime. We can see John's mental health deteriorating and him becoming increasingly jealous and hurt by Mark leaving. The other scene that has always stuck with me is at the Olympic trials when Tatum, in a fit of rage and depression, begins to eat a ton of food and is then forced to work it all off in almost no time at all. I don't want to be a wrestling hater, but I think it really highlights the dangers of the sport and how physically and mentally taxing it could be. I don't want to speak for all wrestlers either, because I know there's probably a lot of opinions about this, but wrestling was really big in my high school, and I remember watching my friends who wrestled have to cut weight all the time, and how difficult that was for them, especially when some of them began to wrestle in college. And they would talk a lot about how some older wrestlers would develop eating disorders, among other things, and that if you're not good enough to compete at a high level, a lot of times it isn't worth it because of the physical toll it takes on your body. And while I have no beef with the sport of wrestling, I think it's very impressive, especially at the professional level. I really appreciate how Miller doesn't shy away from the more difficult aspects of the sport. All of this built-up masculinity and tension leads to the ending of the film, where DuPont shoots Dave in his driveway, killing him dead. It's a shocking and brutal outburst of violence that, combined with Miller's style, hits especially hard. I think Carell does a pretty good job of expressing that emotional void in DuPont, as well as his jealousy and mental instability. It's a brutal ending and packs a punch, but definitely left me feeling numb. During the course of filming, the real Mark Schultz came to set a number of times, as well as Dave's widow Nancy and her children. They all seemed to appreciate how the story was handled and how it honored Dave's memory. Ruffalo was even given Dave's real glasses to wear in the film by Nancy. After the film was released, Mark Schultz became very on and off again about his feelings towards the film, sometimes praising it, other times criticizing it. It seems that his greatest point of contention was that the film hints at an underlying sexual tension that John felt for Mark. And personally, I think that's a very interesting theme that Miller is pushing here, because of the physicality and the masculinity of the sport. Eventually, Mark walked his statements back and apologized to Miller, saying that he did love the film. At its premiere at Cannes, it received critical acclaim, winning Miller Best Director. It would go on to be a strong awards contender too, appearing on a number of top 10 lists and landing itself 5 Oscar nominations, including Best Director, Best Actor for Carell, and Best Supporting Actor for Ruffalo, but no third Best Picture nominee in a row for Miller. Personally, I think that Best Actor nomination should have gone to Tatum instead of Carell, but it really doesn't matter.
I don't know what's gonna happen in the future, but Nancy and I'd like to try and make it work here.
You and I both know that I can't stay here.
I know, Mark.
And this is where Miller has left us. According to him, he's been working on a new adaptation of A Christmas Carol for a number of years, which would be a real departure from his character studies that have defined his work. He also has a recent acknowledgement on Tar. Not sure why, but my previous video was about another 3-time director, Todd Field, who made Tar, so I don't know, funny coincidence. When making a video like this, you kind of hope for really exciting explanations for gaps in a person's filmography, but for Miller it was much simpler than I expected. He's a director who doesn't feel the need to make a film if he doesn't have a strong passion for it, and is very particular about what films he chooses. I also think people, myself included, seem to forget that development hell is a big thing with some directors, and it stops them from making more films. I've really come to appreciate Miller's approach to storytelling. He's a director that clearly enjoys dissecting a character, which presumably attracted him to Capote, and what I think caught the studio's attention when they hired him for Moneyball. He is a great observer and uses his camera sparingly in order to put more attention on performance. This is why I believe that not only have all 3 of his leading actors been nominated for an Oscar, but all 3 of his main supporting characters have been nominated as well. After watching a lot of behind the scenes and commentary videos of his work, it's very clear that Miller is a true collaborator and loves to give due credit to the people he works with. He excels at creating a very specific visual tone and atmosphere, and then uses that to give actors the space to shine. I think I'd really enjoy seeing Miller work with other idiosyncratic writers like a Sorkin type, because I think he has a style that can potentially mesh very well with other writers. But we'll see what the future holds for him. Hopefully we'll get a new film from Miller sooner than later. Thanks for watching, guys. If you have a favorite Miller film or thoughts about the director, let me know in the comments down below. And if there's something you'd like me to cover, let me know too. I have a couple of videos I'm cooking up, so hopefully I can get some of those out sooner than later. If you want to follow me on Twitter or Letterboxd, I'll leave those down below too. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.